What's up? I'm John O, and today we're going to be wrapping up how we can use frequencies in our keyboards to evoke a feeling. We're going to be getting into a little bit of music theory, but stay with me, I'll keep it simple and easy to follow, I promise. The first thing I want to touch on is chord voicings. Simply playing a song in whatever chord voicings happen to be convenient is such a waste of your instrument's potential. Let me show you 3 simple things you can try with your chord voicings. The first is creating a sense of movement. For example, if I wanted to create a rising or ascending feeling in a song, I could use chord voicings and inversions that allow me to ascend up my keyboard. A simple example of this would be me playing a basic C major chord. Now, because I'm gradually rising up my keyboard, I've created a sense of upward movement even with no change in my chords. This is pretty basic stuff for the average keyboardist, but there are powerful applications when used in a chord progression of a song, and I'll cover this in more detail in next week's video when I talk about guitars, so be sure to watch that too. The second thing you can do with chord voicings is creating space in the frequency spectrum by leaving out some notes from your chords. This is helpful when you want to avoid a song feeling heavy or when you just want a cleaner sounding mix, and this is something I apply all the time on guitars as well. Let me show you what I mean. If I'm playing a C major chord, these are the notes that make up the chord: the C, the E, and the G. By habit, most keyboardists would use their left hand to play the root, or 2 octaves of the root, or the root and the 5th. But we shouldn't be doing anything by habit, right? Remember, we should be asking ourselves what's the feeling we want to convey in the song. If we want to convey a feeling of elevation or excitement, then adding low mids in our left hand doesn't necessarily help. So we could just leave out our left hand entirely, which is exactly what I did in our 30-second pop hit, and it sounded great. Now let's take this example further. Supposing I want to play a C major 7 in my song. We have the same notes as the C major with the new addition of the B, the 7th. In most cases, I could safely omit the root because the bass would already be playing it, or I could just play the root with my left hand. Let's compare the two, with the root in my right hand and with the root in my left hand or in the bass. We didn't lose any of the flavor of the chord, right? But we just freed up some valuable real estate in the frequency spectrum. Let's push this idea further still. Suppose I'm playing a chord progression moving from a C major to a D minor. In Western music, we often associate major chords with more happy feelings and minor chords with more sad feelings.
Long live the king.
Sometimes I don't want that obvious distinction in my chord progressions. So what I might do is leave out the 3rd from my chords, because the 3rd is the only note that gives any chord its major or minor distinction. With our C major chord, the major 3rd is the E, and with our D minor chord, the minor 3rd is the F. Still with me?
Great!
Let's see this in action. This is the C major to the D minor, and this is the C chord to the D chord with no 3rds. This immediately gives the chord progression a more open, ambiguous feeling, which is sometimes the exact feeling I want. Pretty cool, right? The third thing you could do with your voicings is use more spread voicings to give the keys a more open sound. Let's look at the default voicing of a C major 7 chord, but this time I'll use a pad to illustrate. This has a more clustered kind of sound. Now let me play the root and the 5th with my left hand, and the 3rd and the 7th with my right hand. This has a bigger, more spread out sound. Application wise, I tend to do this when I want the keys to sound big and full, but not really noticeable in the mix. And the reason this works is when you play more close voicing, you've got a build-up of frequencies in this one area, and so your ears notice it. Whereas the feeling that I'm going for when I use spread voicings is like if I asked you what was the instrumentation in the song, you wouldn't name the pad first or even notice it was there at all. But if I muted the pad, suddenly the song would feel super empty. This is the kind of thing that's much harder to pull off with any other instrument like guitars, for example, so that's why it's a cool trick to use. As far as technique goes, there isn't really a formula per se to this, but typically what a keyboardist would do is play the 1st and the 5th on their left hand, and then on your right hand you could use whatever voicings allow you to spread your notes apart. Different voicings really create different feelings in a song, so you should totally try different voicings to see the feelings that they create together with the other elements in the song. Pro tip! Some things to keep in mind when choosing using your chord voicings in a song. It's always worth checking to see how your chord voicings interact with the vocals. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose you're playing a C major chord. You'd think surely the C note would be totally halal anywhere on the keyboard because it's the root of the chord, right? But suppose the vocal melody is hitting a B note, which happens to be one semitone away from the root.
Ew, gross.
Suddenly it sounds horribly dissonant, even though nothing that's happening with the notes is actually wrong. As we saw earlier, the B in the vocal melody combined with the notes of the chord simply form a C major 7, which is actually a really pretty chord. So why does this sound so wrong? Because my chord voicing contains a C which is in the same octave as the vocal melody's B, just one semitone apart. When you have chord voicings that are one or even two semitones apart from the vocal melody, you get this horrible clashy sound. Now watch what happens when I just drop the C, my root, down an octave. Immediately the dissonance is gone and we're back to the really pretty sound of a C major 7. Is this not an awesome pro tip? Bear in mind, we haven't even looked at what the vocals and the harmonies are doing, so there's tons of opportunities for accidental clashes. I'll talk about this in more detail in a future video looking at how we can avoid clashing notes on stage. Lastly, when you choose your chord voicings, pay close attention to what the highest notes on your right hand are doing, because that's typically where the listener's ear is drawn to. Which brings me to the final thing I want to talk about today, lead lines. In part 1 of this series, I explained that in our 30-second pop hit, the vocals in the chorus were actually pretty low for my range. So I talked about what I did with the vocals to add to the feeling of lift and excitement that I wanted. Another thing I did was intentionally have both my keys and guitars playing pretty high up to add to the high mids and highs in the mix. Because remember, high mids and highs add lift and excitement. To further draw the listener's ears to the high mids in the keys, I played a lead line with just the highest notes of my chord phrasings, because those are usually the most noticeable notes to the listener. Notice the lead line sits very close to the frequencies that the vocals were sitting in, so I planned the rhythms of the lead line so that most of the movement happens when the vocals are absent. More on this when we cover rhythms. This is a really useful trick for you to use. For example, if you're a worship leader and you're forced to sing a song in a key that's too low for you, you can utilize the other vocalists to give the song the lift that it needs, like we talked about in part 1, or you could utilize the other instruments, like what I did with the keys and guitars. Okay, I believe that's been a lot to take in, so I'll stop here. I hope this has been useful stuff for you guys, and if it has, do share this video with your friends or your bandmates that you want to try out these principles with, and let me know how it goes. I'm John O. Don't forget to subscribe for more.